Welcome. If you're in the right room, it's Zone 1. It's about immigration reform and advocacy. And I'm Dorothy Grady, and here with Charles Parasino, who is our technical expert. Charles?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As we go along during the presentation, try to keep yourself muted. And if you have questions, add them into the chat, and we'll have a pretty robust question and answer section as well. And we just came off a really great discussion. So I know we're all looking forward to really getting into this issue as well.
Thanks, Charles. Okay, well, our presenter for this time is attorney Glen Formica from New Haven, where he's an immigration attorney. He was selected as a super lawyer in 2019 and 2020, and I think you'll agree that this was well deserved. He received his law degree from the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and you may recognize his name as I did when I was reading about a New Haven mother of 4 who, after living in Connecticut for 24 years, she had a steady job, no arrests, and she was going to be deported to Guatemala. It was attorney Formica who represented her. We are really glad that you're here and really appreciative of all the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thank you everybody for tuning in and being interested in immigration. I'm gonna just give you a little bit, or do something that I hate doing, which is talking about myself. But my experience with immigration law sort of follows the arc of the past 20 or more years of immigration law and also immigration policy in this country. So just a little bit about myself. I graduated from Catholic University in 1997, Catholic University Law School. I was working for a bougie firm down in DC, trying to live a lifestyle. I had a client in Connecticut, corporate client, that I was assigned to, and I had an opportunity to take my Australian wife, so that was my first experience with immigration law, was my marriage. And we moved to Connecticut. And when I came to Connecticut, I thought I was going to be living the LL Bean dream. I would be a property lawyer, and everything would be proper and beautiful. I'd wear blue blazers every day, khaki pants, LL Bean boots, all the stereotypes of Connecticut. I should mention I had been born in Connecticut. I just grew up in a town in New Hampshire before I came back 30 years after my birth. So I'm really not digging on Connecticut when I say that. But that was kind of my expectation, was I was moving into a middle-class suburban life and that I would be doing property law. What happened was I was working in Cheshire, Connecticut for that smaller firm, which did a lot of property law for that corporate client I had down in DC. And then one evening, a Franciscan monk, now that's the important thing about the Catholic University. Otherwise, you could presume that God was truly playing with my life and my career. But a Franciscan monk just showed up randomly in Cheshire, Connecticut from Brooklyn, New York, with an Eritrean boy. And this was right after the Alien Gonzalez story, if everyone can, those on the call that can remember 1999 with Cuban undocumented child ended up in Miami and Janet Reno, and there was a raid, and it was quite an issue. It was really sort of brought immigration to the forefront. So that was my first immigration case, and I ended up working, working out that issue. He was a special immigrant juvenile. The Franciscan monk had brought this kid from Eritrea whose parents had been killed during an Ethiopian onslaught of Eritrea briefly at that time. And the monk had managed to get him out of the country and bring him here. So he was an orphan child, and I was able to get him a special immigrant juvenile status. Now, when I was starting that was in 1999. And a major change in immigration law had just happened in 1996, and it was called IRA. And that was the last time that we had comprehensive immigration reform. There's been a few failed attempts since, but no one's ever been successful. So that's just a little bit of background before I tell you what's going on today. But let me tell you about the 1996 comprehensive immigration reform, IRA. So the good news is it gave people who were physically present prior to December 20th, 2000, and filed a petition. I'm not going to get into the weeds of it, but filed something with immigration, I'll just say that, prior to April 30th, could stay in the country even if they had come in without papers or they had overstayed a visa. Now, the catch to that was that Jefferson Sessions, then Senator Sessions, passed behind it a slate to get those amnesties, quote amnesties, passed a slate of very restrictive immigration laws, like unprecedented in US history. Because if any of us are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants, the way the laws used to be is that you'd come in, usually without permission, usually without a visa. You would start your life here, and then after a few years, there would be ways that you could obtain legal status. Or if your family came over from Italy or Europe after World War II, you came in on some special refugee visas and so forth. But in 1996, all of that ended. All of it ended. And that's what we've been living under for the past 20 years. And notably, what changed in 1996 were three things. One is they said that if you came in without permission, the way our grandparents, not all, the majority did, or you overstayed a visa, you were here legally, but your time expired, you would be subject to a 10-year bar. That means 10 years before you can do anything else in the United States. And from my experience, even after 10 years, you're not getting back into the United States. It also set up the immigration courts, really revamped the immigration court system to be this whole court system that was set up on the pretense that they were providing people with due process. You know, because you see a judge in a black robe, you see somebody who looks like a prosecutor called a trial attorney, and you expect that it's all going to be nice and orderly. The only problem with it is that you're not guaranteed a lawyer, so you don't get a lawyer when you're in immigration court, and you're not given the rules of evidence. The rules of evidence are very relaxed. So basically, it's whatever the government throws into the record goes into the record. So that was this system that started in 1996 after IRA. And then the third thing that IRA did was it gave a host of new reasons that you could be excluded from the United States. And so minor crimes could make you deportable. And again, only because I have a short amount of time here, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on what all of that means. But the best analog that I could give you for the 1996 law passed by Jefferson Sessions was the Black Codes of Reconstruction. It created felonies out of minor infractions. It created a second-tier court system. And, you know, prior to the 1960s, you weren't guaranteed a public defender, right? Well, you're not guaranteed a lawyer in immigration court today. And it created an incarceration system that has grown and grown and grown. So now we have immigrants who are picked up on minor infractions, who are placed into an incarceration system without the right to an attorney. And if everyone is ready for it, you're really not entitled to a bond. Bond is a very specious thing in immigration court. And again, I won't get into the weeds of it. So what we have in the country now is a system of laws started in 1996. And because this is political, I have to acknowledge that it was the president I voted for, Bill Clinton, passed this law. And I believe our current president, Biden, signed on to this law as a signatory. I was trying to look that up before I jumped on just to be 100% certain. I believe he voted for IRA, to be fact checked. But this horrendous system that's developed over the past 20 years has a couple of effects. One is that it creates a suppressed labor force, which is afraid of being arrested, afraid of being incarcerated without access to a lawyer or bond, free access to a lawyer. They're allowed access to a lawyer, but you have to pay them. And in Connecticut, if you get picked up, you're sent to Greenfield, Mass, which is up on the Vermont border, or you're sent to Plymouth, which is over by Cape Cod. And if you've driven to either of those destinations, it's about 3 hours from New Haven to, or 4 hours really, to Plymouth, and about 2.5, 3 hours to Greenfield, depending on how you drive. So you have to pay a lawyer a day's rate, if you can afford it, just to go visit you and work out your immigration case. That's the background of the immigration law. Now, under President Bush, there was a brief attempt at immigration reform in 2007. It died, and I'm not really the right person to explain the politics of it, but the Democrats, is my understanding, didn't move forward. They had the opportunity to move forward on the law, and it died. It died in the Senate. In 2008, President Obama came in. He did a couple of things around the edges with immigration. He never made a big push legislatively. Your senator, Blumenthal, my Senator Blumenthal, actually put an immigration reform bill in the Senate. It passed the Senate, and then it died in the House. I mean, Senator Blumenthal is a superhero, but unfortunately he's a constitutional officer of the Senate and not the House. Obama never went to the well for it, and then we never got immigration reform that we might have had Senator Blumenthal's efforts and supported. So with Obama, he went around the edges and he passed executive orders, which are like kingly decrees. And he just basically said, since it's my responsibility through the Department of Justice to decide who gets deported, like what's the priority, I'm going to decide that we're going to prioritize people who are, serious crimes, not minor crimes, but serious crimes. So people with like 2 DUIs is a serious crime. And it is a serious crime, but people with DUIs were prioritized for removal. People with, obviously sex offenses or more serious offenses were prioritized. The issue was that a lot of immigrants most immigrants are non-criminal. It's a very small fraction of immigrants who actually have criminal records. And the criminal records that they have generally involve domestic or alcohol. And if you think about it from a sociological, psychological standpoint, you have a highly stressed population. I think, not being a counselor in practice, just being a counselor at law, and having seen my clients go through it for 20 years, a lot of their low-level criminality, I think, is usually stress-related. It's arguments with spouses, and it's alcohol-related instances. But those things would bring people to the attention of ICE, and then ICE would would lock them up. Whereas the state of Connecticut might put them on a personal recognizance. They could be subject to bonds of $80,000, and that's cash bond of $80,000. That means you got to produce the whole $80,000. Hartford had the highest bond rate in the country at one point, just to keep it real and keep it immediate. So under Obama, that's what we had. We had a prioritized removal system, and we also had this sort of reevaluation of what constitutes criminality. He did issue an executive order, which was just recently upheld by the Supreme Court. But frankly, it was held up on the fact that the Trump administration was so incompetent in arguing the legal issue that they didn't have to decide it. And then it was subsequently upheld by a lower court out of New York. Try not to get too far into some of the granular stuff that was involved. But DACA was basically just deferred action for childhood arrivals. And it said, if you were here prior to 2007 and subject to some other conditions, I'm glazing over it, you could get a temporary work authorization and remain in the United States until another president tries to deport you. That was the extent, really, of Obama's immigration work. Trump came along. He built on the Obama infrastructure for removing people, because as part of Obama's program was he had people reporting to ICE in order to get temporary work authorizations, which is what most immigrants and most of my clients want, because they want to pay taxes, Social Security that they'll never partake in, and contribute and have a legitimized existence and support their families. So for a brief period of time, Obama had a program where if you went to ICE voluntarily and gave them your address, they would give you, over the course of several weeks, a temporary work authorization. Millions of people enrolled. Trump came in 2016. And that's kind of where my life and my career changed dramatically. The majority of my practice was civil litigation, but I did a very large immigration practice, mostly pro bono, but some for fee. And I was kind of in a nice split. I had a partner at the time who was really developing the immigration practice, and handling the day-to-day. Trump came in, and suddenly we had sweeps. We had people getting locked up. We had families, mothers being told to board airplanes. I found myself in between 2017 and 2018 in a number of church basements representing people with TV cameras out front, which as a lawyer, I can tell you is probably the most nauseating thing you'd have to go through. I can also tell you as a lawyer, giving the middle finger to the largest law enforcement agency, the largest law firm in the United States, the Department of Justice, at the time headed by Jefferson Sessions, the architect of the very law that was the bane of my existence. All of that to me was a crashing midlife crisis. But in that position, there really wasn't much I could do. The people that were loading onto that Trump was trying to swiftly deport were mostly poor. They were, many of them were women with children. Miriam Martinez was a case that was in the news quite prominently. Senator Blumenthal was very active in that case. She was a mother with a 12-year-old daughter who had type 1 diabetes and required hourly insulin injections. It wasn't just type 1 diabetes, it was a particularly complicated presentation of it. ICE had told her to buy a plane ticket to go back to Guatemala and leave her child. I thought that was reckless endangerment of a child. So I told ICE, I'm going to send my client home. If you want to go get her, go to her house and drag her out in front of her children and put her on an airplane yourself. But she's not going to voluntarily buy a ticket to do that. Senator Blumenthal called me on my phone as I was driving back to New Haven that day, having just left ICE, and asked me where the press conference was going to be, because we were going to tell ICE what we thought of their policies. I mentioned that little side story just to tell you how confrontational immigration has become and how politicized it became during the Trump administration. I think all of you know it because you watch the news, probably, hopefully, in horror at what was happening. But at the street level, what was happening was families in Connecticut were being told to buy plane tickets and permanently leave their families. So we had a great election. I thought finally I could go back to my life doing civil litigation, doing immigration as well, but kind of rebalancing my expectations of what would happen. And then we had that mess of an election that thankfully ended up with Biden as president. But it was a mess of election because we lost in the House. We lost seats in the House, and we barely won the Senate. As one of Biden's day one priorities, he put an immigration proposal on the table. And it is pretty much, from what I hear, dead on arrival. So we're in a stasis again, where on the street level, as an immigration lawyer, the tone is better. I can tell you, if you go up to Hartford, at least as of 2 weeks ago, President Trump's picture in the ICE office is right there through the window. You don't even have Biden on the wall. You still have Trump on the wall. So you still have all of Trump's venom and vitriol in training of ICE officers. So the mindset with ICE is Biden may have won the election, or maybe in some of their minds didn't win the election, depending on what conspiracy they're paying attention to. But we're going to wait this out. And we have discretion at the local level as to how we're going to handle these cases. So the national tone is better. At the street level, remains to be seen. People are not, as far as I'm aware, being loaded onto airplanes. But I think that has more to do with COVID-19. And I think it's going to remain to be seen as to how things play out from the administration level. I know at a very high level, the people in charge of DHS are desperately, and I've been on phone calls with some of them through some other advocacy stuff that I've been doing. They're really trying to work to change the culture. The problem is you can change the culture for as long as you have a president whose culture is, humane, logical, and sensible. Should that culture change again, we could be right back to where we were under the Trump administration. As far as the border, which I know is what a lot of people are watching on the news, I personally, spent a fair amount of time in Texas on a couple of pro bono cases where we had kids stuck, parents stuck. The border situation is trying to be better from what I can tell. I'm not really seeing it because you have some of the most difficult judges. Because when you show up at the border, you get locked up in a cage. You're given a saran wrap blanket in a space on the floor, because we really do that in this country to refugees. And then you go in front of an immigration judge. And my experience down in Texas at some of these places is I'm not quite sure if I'm there for an immigration hearing or I'm there at some bizarre auction, because the immigration judge is talking so fast and deporting my client so fast that I'm not sure I know fully what's going on. I can't get a word in edgewise. I mean, it's all, how fast can we move these along? Under President Trump, people weren't even being allowed that minimum process of going in front of an immigration judge. Many of them were just being pushed back across the border or returned to Mexico. So I have just spoken for exactly 25 minutes. I hope I haven't overwhelmed everyone. Maybe it's a good time for me to pause and ask if anybody has any questions about where immigration has been and sort of what's happened. And if not, I can talk a little bit about where I think immigration is going.
I do have a couple of questions that have been submitted for you, and I do encourage other people to put your questions in the chat so we can try to get to everyone. But when somebody comes without undocumented and living for years in Connecticut or any other state, what is the process right now for them to become citizens?
So, my Italian grandparents on both sides came in without papers. In the case of my grandfather, he jumped ship. And he waited for, I think, about 4 or 5 years, and he was given an opportunity to apply. This is going back to the 1930s. That's the way things have worked up until 1996. And I'm going to keep harping on 1996 and the change in the law, because if there's one takeaway from the conversation, I want everyone to understand how bad that law was and how much that changed our history on immigration. So unlike that old way of doing things, that you wait your time and then you can change your status, I'm keeping it very simple. Today you can't, because if you came in without permission or you overstayed your visa, there's only a few limited circumstances that you can avail yourself of to get legal status. So the first one is marry a United States citizen. And I'm not talking about immigration love or the 90-day fiance or something, which is a TV show about people getting married for a green card. This is like the long message putting out there. So you can marry a US citizen, and that's really it. If you came in with a visa and overstayed and married a US citizen, you can stay in the country. There's a process. Provided you've only once come in and overstayed. If you came in twice, you're permanently barred. You can never get a green card, even if you marry a US citizen. The second way to get legal status, if you come in, and if you came across the border without permission, and subject to certain other immigration offenses, you can't, even if you marry a US citizen, you can't get your legal papers. So there's 1,000 ways that you can't get the green card. There's a handful of ways that you can get a green card. Currently, because under Obama, if you came in without permission once, not twice, once, and you've never left, and you marry a US citizen, you can apply the first step, which is a petition. It's called an I-130 petition. It's a form number. And you can also do this if you marry a lawful permanent resident, but it gets a little more complicated if you're not a citizen. You file that petition, you say, hey, I have a really good marriage to this US citizen spouse over my shoulder. And we want to stay here and start our lives. Once that gets approved, and usually it gets approved as long as it's not a fake marriage, then you have to file to get a waiver of the 10-year bar. So you have to show an extreme hardship to the US citizen spouse, that if you can't stay here, she'll be depressed, he'll be depressed, gross loss of job opportunities, won't be able to see their children from another marriage because of custody issues that don't allow them to live abroad, take the kids outside the country. So extreme hardship. If that gets approved, then you fly back to your country of origin, you go for an interview at the US consulate, and then you fly back in as a green card holder. That is the major way that people fix their legal status, is that provisional waiver if they marry a US citizen. Now, two things. The fact that you may have, if you overstay your visa or you come in illegally or without permission, you are not able to have an employer file for you. It just doesn't happen. Nada. I mean, I get 1,000 questions a year. Why can't I petition for it? You can't do it through employment. It's a myth. Second thing is, no matter if you're willing to sign for them as a God-fearing, beer-drinking American, that one is a good one. Doesn't matter. You can't do it. There's very limited ways that you can get legal status. There's such misconception out there, especially in the far-right media, about all these loopholes that exist in the immigration law. No, 1996, all the loopholes got turned into nooses, and the ones that weren't nooses just got closed out altogether. 1996 was the diaspora. It was the end of the American dream. It was catastrophic. We've got to change it. I don't know if I can put enough hyperbole with that. So.
Well, if somebody is deported from Connecticut, how long does it take them to get back?
10 years to never.
10 years to never. Okay. Well, that seems like a long time.
Yeah, no, I had, in fact, there's a family that was in the news actually under Obama. who had been here 20 years. He was a soccer coach in Fairfield County, a very popular guy. We can't, because of COVID, 11 and a half years later, he still hasn't been back. He missed his kids' graduations from high school. His daughter, I believe, is engaged to get married. They're holding off the marriage. His house went into foreclosure. The kids went on welfare. The wife had a nervous breakdown. All the while, we were fighting to bring this guy back. It took us more than 10 years, and we still can't get him an interview.
Wow. You do a lot of work with other advocacy groups, and here's a question. What can we do to support immigrants?
So glad you asked. There's really two levels of support, maybe three levels. The first level of support is, to the extent that you're able to, inform yourself of what's really happening. And through your, I know this sounds really soft, corny, squishy, but through your friend networks, spread the information, the correct information. The second thing is, change the tone around immigrants. The problem with immigration generally is that it's been racialized and unfortunately politicized. So when you talk about immigration, it's a little bit like talking about the COVID vaccine, right? I mean, you're pro-immigration if you're a Democrat, and you're anti-immigration if you're a Republican. I'm going to get vaccinated if I'm a Democrat, and I'm not going to get vaccinated if I'm a Republican. I mean, unfortunately, that's the tone. As you're advocating quietly among family and so forth, you need to change it, and you need to personalize it, and you need to humanize it. And part of that is, look at your own family experience with immigration. And I don't care if your family experience was in, 1750, or your family's immigration experience was in the 1930s or 40s. I know in my own family, all immigrant, first generation, the generation above me, I have people who are just wildly Trump supporters telling me, that I've got the immigration law wrong and it's not possibly that way. So I think it's good to personalize it to the family. Do research on your own family immigrant experience and find out what the immigration laws were back then, and then moving to the more concrete things that you can do. There's a number of organizations, unfortunately, they're more, unfortunately for the people in the quiet corner. Most of these organizations are down in New Haven to Stanford. Whether it's Make the Road or ULA, there's the Connecticut Immigrants Coalition. There is IRIS. There's a lot of different organizations that you can get involved in. I work with all of them, situationally on different cases that come up. And then the third thing is when you are, concrete at the state level, we really need to be working at the legislative level to get the legislators to start passing sensible restrictions on how our police officers and our state offices interact with ICE. I'm not one who advocates for, no cooperation with the federal government. This isn't Alabama in the 1960s. You're not going to be George Wallace on the left. We do need to cooperate with immigration officials, but I don't believe that when somebody gets pulled over for driving without a license, that should become an encounter with ICE. Because what happens when that happens is that when ICE shows up, that person is going to be detained without bond, likely detained without bond, or reasonable bond, not have access to an attorney. And so driving without a license becomes a jail sentence in some cases of more than a year, without access to family, training programs in the prison. So we really need to work at the state level to try to get meaningful policies as to how the state interacts with ICE. I saw in the comments section, people had questions about the Trust Act. The Trust Act to me is trusting that the people enforcing the Trust Act are actually going to follow the Trust Act. Police officers really are without consequence. They have a personal cell phone. I have direct experience with police officers calling ICE and ICE showing up right behind their squad car and arresting somebody. Now, should they have called ICE? No. Do they call ICE? Yes. ICE also has free access to the court docket. They like to show up when people are coming in to pay their tickets, or if they're paying child support, if they're going to their probation office. ICE just happens to be hanging around, picks them up and takes them away. And the problem with that is, as a state, we have a vested interest in people showing up for their court hearings. We have a vested interest in people showing up for probation, and we have a vested interest in people paying child support. So why would we let another agency of the federal government frustrate that process? They're interfering with our operation of government by prioritizing their detention of immigrants. There's other ways that if they need to detain people, that they can do it. And it doesn't have to be at our courthouses or probation offices or whatever.
Okay, here's 2 questions from Mark Koulos. Have visa limits been loosened under Biden? Limits on certain number of citizens coming from particular countries, and have work visa limits and requirements changed? Example, H-1B, farm workers, etc.
No, not at all. Pretty much everything is the same at the visa level. I can tell you from anecdotal experience and a certain amount of literature that's put out by the American Immigration Lawyers Association called AILA. Not much has really changed in that regard. H-1Bs are still a highly competitive visa category. Very few are selected every year, and hundreds of thousands of people apply. I was, rather, my client was the victim under Trump because they passed so many crazy federal regulations and random policies that sort of frustrate the process. It's going to take at least a year or more for the Biden administration to go through the administrative process of undoing those things, so that we might have a more sensible visa processing policy. But it's going to take time. You have to notice, you have to publish in the Federal Register. There's a whole process to it. Trump had 4 years to screw it up. We'll have 4 years to fix it.
I hope that works. Let's see, here's from Brian Anderson. A couple of young advocates told me they were pushing to limit municipal voting rights for immigrants. I don't understand this concept and worry that if it fits a Trump fear-mongering frame. Are you aware of this?
I really can't. I know of the issue. I can't speak to it too intelligently. I can tell you as an immigration lawyer, because of the consequences of voting when you're not a U.S. citizen, consequences to your immigration status are pretty profound. I generally discourage my clients from doing that. But I'm speaking as a lawyer to client. Unless they're 100% sure that they're going to be in the clear on that vote, that they can do that. You can vote at very at the local level. There's an exception to it. Depending on the situation, I was kind of discourage it with the clients. Now, do I think that we should allow that that we should immigration should back off scrutinizing that? Absolutely. As far as I'm concerned, if you're a member of a community, you should have the full franchise of that community, meaning vote in town and municipal elections, participate in your schools, advocate and do all of those things. That is important, not just because it's the fair thing to do, because it's, I hate to say it, the American thing to do, but that's important because we want immigrants to be integrated into our broader community. I can tell you that, having done some reading and study of the European model, I mean, you have generations of French immigrants who never partake of the French enterprise, right? So you have generations of people who are just undocumented, living in squalor or living in political squalor, and they've never integrated into their communities. That's very dangerous. The best policy we can have is full integration of immigrants into our communities. And we also need policies that allow immigrants the opportunity to become US citizens. I mean, the latest census has taught us that the United States is turning into Japan. We're flatlining and going over a cliff demographically in terms of population growth. And we may even see negative population growth. Now, immigration gives us an opportunity to either stabilize that decrease or increase it. I don't want to get too far off topic, but there's talking points that you could certainly use as you're advocating or speaking about immigration that aren't so much about the humanitarian side of it as much as it is the political side of it. I'm a little off on a tangent because the voting question brought it to mind.
Okay, here's a question from Alyssa. Are there any NGOs in Connecticut that work to provide immigrants with legal representation? If so, how can we help or participate?
So thank you for asking that. Not enough. There's some legal representation. Building One Community has a legal rep program down in Stamford. It's not very large. Moving up 95, there's Siri. They have probably the most known legal representation project, but not very much. Make the Road offers some legal representation, but not very much. And then you have Iris offers limited legal representation, not very much. So we need to really work on that and think about that. I was part of a pilot project that was going to try to get universal representation for people who were detained, at least. That unfortunately did not pan out after some good effort that was being coordinated through Connecticut Legal Aid. I think it's worthy of being resuscitated, and if there are people who are interested in it, I think you should reach out to some of those organizations that I just mentioned. Certainly, if they want to reach out to me, I'm happy to try to redirect them. From a human rights standpoint, living next door to the Hartford Immigration Court, I think it's just completely unacceptable that we don't have people who are detained. If you're detained, if you're locked up, these are not good places to be locked up. They need to have free legal representation, period. End of sentence. You cannot do this. We cannot allow it to happen in Hartford. It's like a bad episode of Locked Up Abroad, except that it's locked up in America. If you understood how bad it was, the outrage your outrage would never end. I would tell people there's a organization in New York called VERA. Kika Matos, who's a very well-known advocate, is actually from Connecticut, from New Haven, is working at VERA as one of the senior directors there. So after, I can maybe connect you even with VERA to talk about whether it's a financial contribution or maybe an organizing contribution that you can do something tangible. But if you wanted an insertion point, that would be a really good insertion point.
Great. Is there any demand from Connecticut businesses to increase immigration or H-1B visas or make them permanent?
Yeah, there's a huge demand. There's also, there's a real lost political opportunity at the state level. When I speak, and unfortunately, in the past couple of years, it hasn't been so much. When I speak to the Chamber of Commerce, small Chamber of Commerce groups, when I tried to reach out or I get invited to speak with sort of Republican-oriented, I wouldn't say they're quote Republican organizations, but Republican-oriented groups. I think everyone knows whom I'm speaking, some of the associations and clubs. There's a real interest in talking about immigration from a business standpoint. When you figure that, I think it's, there was a study out of Stanford that as of 2016, something like 25% of patents in the past 20 years, between 1986 and 1996, I think was the study, in 2016, something like 26% of all US patents were filed by immigrants. You think about that for a quarter. More than a quarter of Nobel Prizes, immigrants. 25% of STEM, new STEM technology workers, immigrants. I mean, the opportunity there to reach out to the business community and say, you need to get behind some immigration reform. And I think it's already kind of baked in, they know it. The United States, at least for now, until people decide we're not worth it anymore. There was a brief period where I was afraid nobody would be coming to the border. Nobody would be trying to come in. We really have the all-star team of the world when it comes to science, technology, and business acumen. I mean, we recruit the brightest just by the opportunities that we still offer, and sort of the community of elite that we've created in this country when it comes to intellectual pursuits. So there's a real big space there to organize and talk about immigration, not from the racial politics of it, not from the social politics of it, not even from the civil justice politics of it, but just to talk about it in pure economic terms. One of the things that I would wish that people would advocate for is if you're a millionaire. That was probably the only progressive immigration that Trump did, mostly through his business associations. You invest $1 million in the United States, you get a green card. I mean, it's a little more technical than that. We should lower that $1 million investment down to maybe $150,000 or $200,000 gross, plus not just $150,000, but maybe employment of 2 U.S. citizens at 125% of the minimum wage. Now you got 2-for-1 job growth. You've got investment in small business. And if you do those things, now you get a green card. Most of my clients, because we've cut off their ability to legitimately pay taxes and participate, would die for the opportunity to pay taxes and legitimize their business, especially if they're getting a green card. So these are like discussion points and points of engagement with a more conservative party or a more conservative viewpoint on immigration. Leave the other stuff aside, build the wall, and just talk about building the economy and adding jobs. I mean, it's really, at that point, you're on equal ground.
So our last question is something that you've touched on before, and that is, what do you think the outlook is for federal immigration reform this year or even next?
So I was hoping you'd ask me like a really uplifting question.
Well, it could
it's
be.
a beautiful Saturday out. I don't want people turning off the computers. Look, it's not good. It's probably not good. What's going to happen is over the next couple of months, while Biden's starting point is just left, there's no incentive for Republicans to go to the table on immigration reform. The reality in my mind is that we're going to end up with some incremental regulatory things like we did under Obama, because Biden's not going to be able to get comprehensive immigration reform. God save us from the midterms if we get a Republican majority in the Senate, or we get a Republican majority in the House. We're going to go back into the cycle that we've had for 20 years. The Republicans raise money by building walls and stirring up hate among uninformed members of the population, particularly uninformed when it comes to immigration. Democrats, put everybody under scrutiny, like immigration now, because it generates a lot of money. People will write checks if you're talking about immigration reform. People will take up that side. It's become it's Roe v. Wade of the left. It's so we make money on it. The problem is immigrants suffer under it, and the greater problem of it is immigration reform really, is not just an existential idea. It's not just a policy. It's talking about people who are going home at night, crying. I can tell you, having spent 20 years in the hell of 450 Main Street, if you ever want to hear a small child screaming down a federal hallway as the leg irons around their father are clanking in that hall, and if that doesn't stir your conscience, nothing will. But no, I don't see that changing. There's a prison industry that has lost money because of de-escalation of drug crimes. They now have an easy population to detain and monitor, so there's a ton of money there. I don't know how you move it through on that. I think collectively, and I'll maybe finish with this, the conservative Supreme Court, written by a Trump-appointed Justice Gorsuch, on April 29th, wait for it, it's called Ms. N-I-Z Chavez, C-H-A-V-E-Z, told immigration that the way they've been putting people in removal proceedings for 20 years is totally incorrect. Now, the decision did not address whether that means 20 years of deportation orders are now invalidated. It will take another 3 years in the ACLU and other well-minded advocates litigating that issue to get to the answer from the Supreme Court. But the question the Supreme Court put on the table in Ms. Chavez, and actually had started that asking that question in 2018, if we organized around it, we could credibly say that unless they fix immigration, they are about to undo 20 years of immigration, of deportations. Biden could pass a regulation based on that decision that says 20 years of people being deported is wiped out. Just doesn't exist anymore. That could set the Republican hair on fire and say, well, we've got to pass a law to fix what that liberal Trump-appointed justice just did to us. That might get people to the table. But that's going to require some organizing. I have a press conference kind of on topic with a group that I was helping in Sanctuary out of Amherst, Mass. I can send you guys the press release later today on it. I would defer to the organizers of that because it's not my press conference, it's theirs. But those are things that you should be looking at. It's got to be that silver bullet type of issue. Ms. Chavez, that might be it. If people make noise about the question, not the answer. The answer is 3 years in the future.
Thank you. Well, I think the uplifting news is that there are people like you here in Connecticut that are helping our immigrants and people that are looking to be deported, that there's a place for them to turn to. Not everywhere, but hopefully in Connecticut, you're gonna save a lot of people.
Well,
And there's a lot of
I think
people.
the uplifting news, Dorothy, is that 20 people came out on a Saturday to listen to immigration. So,
I was just going to say, and you've got a whole new group of people that would like to work on this. So thank you very much.
no, thank you guys.
Thank you. So all of the people that are here, we're going to close now. And if you're going to the channel, Zone 1, next workshop, you're going to be put into a waiting room, and then you'll come back. But the good news is that for you and your friends who might like to watch Glen do this all over again, in the next few weeks, Chris Pitts will be, it's being recorded, and he will be putting it out so that people can watch it. And if you chose, some of your friends might have chosen a different workshop to go to, they can come back and watch this one too. So thank you all for participating, and thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.